I never thought the place I called home would feel like a stranger's battlefield. Last Thursday, when my daughter-in-law told me I was ghosting the family, little did she know I had been watching her shadow every day, especially what she was doing to my room and to my husband. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 72, I thought I understood how family worked. I thought love meant sacrifice, and sacrifice meant silence. I was wrong about so many things. But that morning in October, when the Chicago wind rattled our 6th-floor windows and carried the scent of fresh bread from Kowalski's bakery below, I discovered just how wrong I'd been. I woke at 5:30, as I had every morning for the past 3 decades. My body ached. Arthritis had been my constant companion for years now, but I pushed through the pain. That's what we do, isn't it? We push through. We endure. We smile even when our hearts are breaking into 1,000 pieces. The apartment felt different that morning, colder. Not just from the autumn chill seeping through our old windows, but from something else. Something I couldn't quite name yet. I shuffled toward my bedroom, the one I decorated so carefully over 30 years of marriage. Soft cream walls that reminded me of summer mornings. Family photos arranged just so on the dresser. My mother's good china displayed in the corner cabinet. Wedding mementos pinned to a small bulletin board like faded trophies of better times. But the door was ajar. Not closed tight like I always kept it. My heart began to race as I pushed it open wider. What I saw inside made me drop the cup of coffee I'd been carrying. It crashed to the floor, ceramic pieces scattering like my shattered sense of home. My carefully kept bedroom, my sanctuary, was destroyed. Clothes thrown everywhere. Stacks of mail piled carelessly across my antique dresser. And there, on the hardwood floor, lay the framed photograph of my son Michael and me from his high school graduation. The glass was spider-webbed with cracks, our smiling faces distorted behind the broken shards. The scent of my lavender sachets, tucked lovingly into every drawer, was completely overwhelmed by a sharp, unfamiliar perfume. My husband Robert's reading chair, the one I'd positioned carefully by the window so he could watch the street below, was pulled out at an odd angle. The bedding was wrinkled and twisted like a storm had passed through. I stood there, trembling, tasting the bitter flavor of betrayal on my tongue. This was supposed to be my weekend away. A small trip to visit my dear friend Martha in Milwaukee. At least that's what I'd told them. The truth was, I'd spent those 2 days in the hospital just 6 blocks away, getting treatment for my worsening arthritis and trying to understand why my own family felt like strangers. But they thought I was gone. They thought I couldn't see what they were doing to my space, to my life, to everything I held dear. The sirens of an ambulance echoed up from Lincoln Avenue below, and I realized I was trapped between the memories of everything I'd given to this family and the cold reality of what they thought of me. You see, I'd always believed that family was safety, a simple truth my own mother had taught me. But standing there in my destroyed bedroom, surrounded by the debris of my private world, I understood that safety had become just another mask. And my daughter-in-law, Christina, wore that mask better than anyone I'd ever known. Let me tell you about Christina. She came into our lives 7 years ago like a summer storm. Beautiful, powerful, and ultimately destructive. Michael was so smitten, so completely under her spell that he couldn't see past her practiced smile to the calculating woman underneath. But I saw it. Oh, I saw it from the very beginning. The engagement ring alone cost more than Robert made in 3 months at the factory. Where did the money come from? Well, that would be from me. From my savings account, the one I'd been building for 30 years with every spare dollar. Mom, I love her so much, Michael had said, his eyes pleading. This ring, it would mean everything to her. To us. How do you say no to your only child when he looks at you like that? How do you explain that something feels wrong without sounding like a jealous mother who can't let go? So I gave him the money. $12,000. More than half of what I had saved for my own old age. For medical bills. For the security I knew I'd need someday. But love makes us do foolish things, doesn't it? Or what we think is love. The wedding was another drain on my finances. Not just the money, though there was plenty of that, but the emotional cost. Christina's family was wealthy, you see. Her father owned several investment properties in Lincoln Park, had made what she called a vast fortune by investing in stocks on the stock market. They talked about money the way other people talked about the weather, casually, constantly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Oh, Eleanor, Christina's mother would say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. It's so sweet how you're contributing to the wedding. Michael told us about your little pension. Little pension. As if my 30 years of working as a secretary at Northwestern Memorial Hospital meant nothing. As if the money I'd earned caring for medical records and sick people was somehow less valuable than their stock options and real estate deals. But I smiled. I always smiled. I paid for flowers and helped with catering costs and bought Christina's bridesmaids gifts because it would mean so much coming from Michael's mother. $23,000 total, nearly everything I had left. The wedding was beautiful, I'll give them that. Christina looked radiant in her designer gown, Michael handsome in his rented tuxedo. I wore my good navy dress, the one I'd saved for special occasions, and tried to ignore the way Christina's family whispered among themselves during the reception. Tried not to notice how they looked at our side of the family with barely concealed pity. "You must be so proud," one of Christina's aunts said to me, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Michael's done very well for himself, marrying into such a good family. Such a good family. As if ours wasn't. As if Robert's 40 years at the steel plant and my decades of steady work meant nothing. As if love and loyalty were less valuable than their wealth in dollars and their connections in high finance." After the wedding, things changed quickly. Michael and Christina moved into our apartment building. Not the same unit, thank goodness, but close enough. Christina had convinced him it was temporary, just until they could save for their own place. But saving seemed to be the last thing on their minds. "Mom, we need help with rent this month," became a weekly refrain. Not a request, really. More like an expectation. Christina would stand in my kitchen, her manicured nails tapping against my old Formica counter, waiting for me to offer what she'd already decided I would give. "Things are tight right now," she'd say, though I noticed her new handbags and expensive shoes. "Michael's job at the insurance company is good, but you know how it is with entry-level positions. We'll pay you back as soon as we get on our feet." But they never got on their feet. Every month brought new emergencies, new needs, new reasons why my pension check needed to be divided among 3 households instead of 1. My own medications got cheaper and cheaper as I switched to generic versions. My groceries became simpler, pasta and canned soup instead of fresh vegetables and meat. But I never said no. How could I? They were family. "You're such a blessing, Mom," Michael would say when I handed over another check. But his eyes wouldn't meet mine. Deep down, I think he knew what was happening. I think he understood that his wife was slowly bleeding me dry. But love, or what he thought was love, made him blind to everything except keeping Christina happy. The requests escalated over time: car payment, credit card bills, a small loan for Christina to start her online boutique, a business that seemed to exist only in her imagination and my bank statements. 500 here, 1,000 there, always with promises of repayment that never materialized. "We're family," Christina would say whenever I hesitated. "Family helps family, right?" "Right. Family helps family." But what happens when only one person is doing the helping? What happens when generosity becomes exploitation and love becomes a weapon? I started keeping track in a small notebook hidden in my bedroom drawer. Not because I planned to demand repayment, but because I needed to see the truth written down in black and white. $37,000 over 3 years. 3 years of my savings, my security, my future, flowing out of my bank account and into their lives like water through a broken dam. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was watching my son change. Michael had always been gentle, thoughtful, the kind of boy who brought me dandelions and called them flowers. But marriage to Christina hardened something in him, made him defensive and distant, made him see me not as his mother who loved him unconditionally, but as an obstacle to his wife's happiness. "You need to understand, Mom," he said during one particularly difficult conversation. "Christina comes first now. That's how marriage works. Christina comes first." I wondered if he'd ever told her that I came first with him once, that there was a time when my opinion mattered, when my feelings were worth considering. But that was before. Before Christina and her demands and her casual cruelty disguised as concern. The microaggressions started small. Comments about my cooking. "Oh, Eleanor, this is interesting. We don't really eat much fried food anymore." Critiques of my appearance. "Have you thought about updating your wardrobe? I know this great personal shopper." Suggestions about my living situation. "Wouldn't you be more comfortable in one of those nice senior communities? You'd have so much help there." Each comment was delivered with a smile, wrapped in false concern, impossible to argue against without seeming unreasonable. That's the insidious thing about emotional manipulation. It makes you doubt your own perceptions. It makes you wonder if you're being too sensitive, too dramatic, too needy. My birthdays began passing without acknowledgement. Oh, there might be a text message. "Happy birthday, so busy with work." But no calls, no visits, no cards. Last Christmas, I wasn't even invited to their celebration until the last minute. and then only after Robert had asked Michael directly about plans. "Of course Mom's invited," Michael had said, but his voice carried that edge of irritation I'd learned to recognize. I thought that was obvious, but it wasn't obvious. Nothing was obvious anymore except the growing distance between us, the widening gap where love used to live. The Christmas gathering was awkward and strained. I brought gifts I'd carefully chosen and budgeted for, receiving in return a generic gift card to a store I'd never shopped at. I sat in my old chair at the dining table, the one I'd used for every family meal for decades, and listened to Christina and Michael discuss their plans for a vacation to Europe, funded by money they definitely didn't have. "Traveling really broadens the mind," Christina said, her eyes bright with anticipation. "We might even look into some investment opportunities while we're there." There was so much money involved in this cryptocurrency thing that Richard, my father, showed us. Part of it was even held in Bitcoin. Bitcoin, investment opportunities, European vacations. While I was shopping at discount grocery stores and skipping my physical therapy appointments because I couldn't afford the copays. After dinner, Christina pulled me aside. "Eleanor, I hope you understand that we can't keep relying on you for everything. Michael and I have talked about it, and we think it's time for us to be more independent. More independent. After 3 years of constant financial support, after thousands of dollars I'd never see again, it would have been funny if it weren't so cruel." "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? I understand, but I didn't understand. Not really. What I understood was that I'd been useful as long as my money lasted, and now that my resources were nearly depleted, they were ready to discard me like yesterday's newspaper. The apartment began to feel different after that. Robert was still there, but he'd grown quieter over the years, more withdrawn. He'd always been a man of few words, but now he barely spoke at all. When I tried to discuss my concerns about Michael and Christina, his standard response was a shrug and, "They're adults, Ellie. Let them figure it out." But they weren't figuring it out. They were drowning, and they were pulling me down with them. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in September. I'd been feeling poorly for weeks. Dizzy spells, chest pains, a persistent cough I couldn't shake. Finally, I'd made an appointment with Dr. Morrison, my physician for the past 15 years. The visit revealed what I'd been afraid to acknowledge. My blood pressure was dangerously high, my stress levels were literally killing me, and I needed immediate medical attention. "Eleanor," Dr. Morrison said, his kind eyes filled with concern, "when did you last take time for yourself? When did you last do something just because it made you happy?" I sat in his office, wearing my good sweater despite the stain on the sleeve I couldn't afford to have dry cleaned, and realized I couldn't remember. Happiness had become such a foreign concept that I'd forgotten what it felt like. "I need to prescribe some medications," he continued, "but more importantly, I need to prescribe some peace. Whatever is causing this stress, you need to address it. Your body is telling you it can't continue like this. The medications cost $230 a month. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Not nearly enough for someone living on a pension that was already stretched to its breaking point." I stood at the pharmacy counter, staring at the total, trying to calculate if I could afford both my heart medication and groceries that week. "Is everything all right, dear?" asked the pharmacist, a young woman with kind eyes who'd helped me before. "Yes," I said, though everything was decidedly not all right. "Just thinking." She lowered her voice. "If cost is an issue, there are programs that might help, and there are generic versions of some of these that might be less expensive." Generic versions. Assistance programs. At 72 years old, after working my entire adult life, after giving everything I had to my family, I was being offered charity at a pharmacy counter while my son and daughter-in-law planned European vacations. That night, I called Michael. Not to ask for money, I'd learned that lesson, but to share my health concerns, to let him know that his mother was struggling and scared and could use some emotional support. "Mom, I can't really talk right now," he said, his voice distracted. "Christina and I are looking at real estate online. Did you know that some people have made fortunes just by flipping houses? Their net worth just keeps growing. Their net worth, while mine dwindled to nothing. Michael, I went to the doctor today." "That's good, Mom. Regular checkups are important. Listen, I really need to go." He hung up before I could explain about my blood pressure or my medications or the fear that kept me awake at night. Before I could tell him that I needed my son, not his money or his time or his complicated life, but just him, just my boy who used to bring me dandelions. I sat in my kitchen that night, the same kitchen where I'd fed him countless meals, helped him with homework, kissed his scraped knees, and told him everything would be all right. The same kitchen where I'd taught him that family meant love and support and being there for each other no matter what. But sitting there alone, surrounded by unpaid bills and empty promises, I began to wonder if I'd taught him wrong. Maybe family didn't mean what I thought it meant. Maybe love wasn't supposed to flow in only one direction. The next few weeks brought a series of small humiliations that felt like death by 1,000 cuts. Christina borrowing ingredients from my kitchen without asking, then acting surprised when I mentioned it. Michael forgetting our weekly phone call for 3 weeks in a row. Robert spending more and more time with his newspaper, hiding behind the sports section when I tried to talk about our son's behavior. Then came the night I fainted in my own kitchen. I'd been making dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta with that jar sauce I bought at the discount store, when suddenly the room began to spin. One moment I was standing at the stove, the next I was on the floor, my cheek pressed against the cold linoleum, staring at the gap under the refrigerator where dust had gathered like gray snow. I'm not sure how long I lay there. Long enough for my pasta to turn to mush in the boiling water. Long enough for the sauce to burn on the bottom of the pan, filling the kitchen with acrid smoke. Long enough to understand that if I died right there on that floor, it might be hours before anyone found me. When I finally managed to stand, my head pounding and my vision still spotty, I cleaned up the mess automatically, threw away the ruined pasta, scrubbed the burned pan, opened windows to air out the smoke. What else was there to do? I didn't call anyone. Who would I call? Michael and Christina were having dinner with her parents, a weekly tradition I'd never been invited to join. Robert was at his weekly poker game with the guys from the plant. My friend Martha lived too far away, and I couldn't bear to worry her with my problems. So I went to bed early, lying in the dark and listening to the sounds of life continuing all around me. Footsteps in the hallway, muffled conversations from other apartments, the distant hum of traffic on Lincoln Avenue. The world kept spinning while I lay there, wondering if anyone would even notice if it stopped spinning for me. 3 days later, Christina finally noticed the burn mark on my cooking pot. "Eleanor, what happened here?" she asked, her voice carrying that tone of mild annoyance I'd grown to recognize. "I had a little accident while cooking," I said carefully. "You need to be more careful. At your age, kitchen accidents can be serious. Maybe it's time to think about meal delivery services. There are companies that specialize in senior nutrition, meal delivery services." Another way of saying I was too old, too incompetent, too much trouble to be trusted with basic tasks like feeding myself. "I'm fine," I said, though we both knew I wasn't. "Of course you are," she replied, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Just be careful, okay?" That was it. No questions about why I might have fallen or whether I needed medical attention. No offers of help or expressions of concern. Just a suggestion that I outsource another piece of my independence to make everyone else's life easier. It was that same week when I made my discovery, the one that changed everything. Robert had been complaining about his old flip phone, a relic from before smartphones became standard. He'd been dropping it constantly, struggling with the tiny numbers, getting frustrated with text messages. So I'd bought him a new phone for his birthday, something simpler and larger that would be easier for his arthritic fingers to manage. His old phone sat in the kitchen drawer for weeks afterward, forgotten among twist ties and rubber bands and all the small debris of daily life. I might never have touched it if I hadn't been looking for batteries for my flashlight during a power outage. The phone still worked. And when I accidentally pressed a button, messages appeared on the screen. Recent messages. Messages between Robert and Christina that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "Did you give her the money for groceries this week?" was the first one I saw. "Yeah, $50 like you said. She didn't ask questions." "Good. We can't have her getting suspicious about where her pension money is really going. Are you sure she doesn't check her bank statements closely? She trusts me to handle the finances. Always has. She barely looks at the statements when they come in the mail." "Perfect. My dad says if we can hold on to this property investment for another 6 months, our returns should be substantial. The dividend income alone should cover our Europe trip." I sat in the dark kitchen, reading message after message, understanding for the first time that the financial stress I'd been attributing to inflation and medical costs was actually something much worse. My own husband, the man I'd trusted with my finances for 47 years of marriage, was systematically stealing from me to fund our son's lifestyle. My pension was being deposited into our joint account, but portions of it were being transferred out before I ever saw the bank statements. Money I thought was going to our household expenses was being redirected to investments that would benefit Michael and Christina. My grocery budget, my medication money, my small luxuries had all been carefully calculated to keep me dependent and unaware, while they built their future on the foundation of my poverty. The phone slipped from my trembling hands and clattered to the floor. In the darkness of that kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of my ordinary life, I finally understood the full scope of my betrayal. It wasn't just Christina's greed, or Michael's indifference, or even Robert's weakness. It was a conspiracy, a deliberate, calculated plan to use me up and discard me. I don't remember how long I sat there. Time seemed suspended, like those moments after a car accident when the world goes quiet and still. Eventually, I heard Robert's key in the lock, his familiar footsteps in the hallway. I managed to pick up his phone and slip it back into the drawer before he reached the kitchen. "Power back on?" he asked, flipping the light switch. "Just came back," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly normal. He nodded and headed toward the bedroom, probably to watch his evening news program. Our conversation, if you could call it that, was over. He had no idea that in those few minutes of darkness, our entire marriage had fundamentally changed. That night, I lay awake next to the man I'd shared a bed with for nearly 5 decades and felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The person I'd trusted most in the world, the one I'd relied on to protect me from financial mistakes and poor decisions, had been systematically robbing me for years. Not for himself. Robert had simple needs and few desires, but for our son, for the boy we'd both loved and raised and wanted to see succeed. How do you process a betrayal that complete? How do you wrap your mind around the idea that your husband, your child, and your daughter-in-law have been meeting regularly to discuss how best to manage your money without your knowledge or consent? That you've become a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected? The next morning, I started paying attention to things I'd overlooked for months. The way Robert shuffled through the mail before I saw it. The way Christina asked pointed questions about my spending. Not out of concern, but to gauge how much I knew about my own finances. The way Michael avoided conversations about money while simultaneously living well beyond what his insurance job could possibly support. I began to decode the language they'd been using around me. Mom's getting forgetful wasn't concern about my mental health. It was groundwork for explaining why I might become confused about financial matters. She worries too much about money wasn't empathy for my anxiety. It was justification for hiding information from me. We want to take care of her wasn't love. It was control. And that weekend trip to Milwaukee I'd mentioned, I hadn't gone to visit Martha at all. I'd checked myself into Northwestern Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where I'd worked for 30 years, because I'd been having chest pains and dizzy spells that I couldn't afford to ignore any longer. I'd told Robert I was going away so he wouldn't worry, but really I was 6 blocks from home, undergoing tests and trying to understand why my body was falling apart. The doctors were clear: stress. Chronic financial worry had pushed my blood pressure to dangerous levels. My heart was working overtime trying to keep up with anxiety that never ceased. My body was shutting down under the weight of problems I couldn't solve and burdens I couldn't share. Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Morrison had said during my second day there, "I need you to understand something. This level of stress is unsustainable. Your body is sending you a message, and if you don't listen, the next message might be a heart attack or a stroke." But how could I explain that the stress wasn't just financial? That it came from loving people who saw me as a resource to be depleted? That my family had become a source of fear rather than comfort? So I'd lied to the hospital too. Told them my stress was just from aging, from normal worries about retirement and health. Let them prescribe medications and recommend lifestyle changes while the real problem sat at my kitchen table every Sunday, smiling and asking how I was doing while plotting my financial destruction. When I returned home that Monday, I'd expected to find everything as I'd left it. But walking into my bedroom, my private space, my sanctuary, I discovered what they'd really thought of my absence. They'd used my room as a storage space, a place to dump clothes and mail and anything else that was inconvenient. They'd moved my furniture, knocked over my photographs, treated my personal space like it meant nothing at all. But the worst part was realizing they'd assumed I wouldn't notice or wouldn't complain, that I'd just clean up the mess and pretend it never happened, the way I'd been cleaning up their messes, financial and otherwise, for years. That's when something inside me finally broke. Not my heart. That had been breaking slowly for years. Something deeper. Something fundamental that had kept me accepting unacceptable treatment in the name of family love and loyalty. I stood in my destroyed bedroom, still wearing the clothes I'd slept in at the hospital, and made a decision. For the first time in more years than I could count, I was going to say no. Not just to money requests or unreasonable demands, but to the entire dynamic that had turned me into a victim in my own life. But first, I needed proof. Real proof that would stand up to their denials and gaslighting and attempts to make me doubt my own perceptions. That afternoon, while Robert was at his physical therapy appointment and Michael was at work and Christina was wherever she spent her days, I drove to my bank, Citizens Bank on North Clark Street, where I'd been a customer for 23 years, where the tellers knew my name and asked about my family and helped me with forms when my arthritis made writing difficult. I'd like to see records of all transactions on my accounts for the past 3 years, I told Patricia, my favorite teller. Everything. Deposits, withdrawals, transfers, automatic payments, all of it. Patricia looked surprised. I'd never asked for detailed records before, but she quickly gathered what I needed. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Patterson?" she asked as she handed me a thick stack of papers. "I hope so," I said, though I suspected everything was far from all right. I took the records to a coffee shop down the street, ordered a cup of tea I couldn't really afford, and began the most painful education of my life. Page by page, transaction by transaction, I traced the systematic theft of my financial security. It was all there in black and white. My pension deposits, faithfully made on the 1st and 15th of every month. And then, like clockwork, the transfers. 500 here, 800 there, sometimes as much as 1,500 in a single transaction. All of it going to accounts I'd never authorized. Investments I'd never agreed to. Purchases I'd never made. The coffee shop grew crowded around me as people came and went, ordering expensive drinks and chatting about their days. But I sat frozen at my small table, staring at proof that my husband had been forging my signature on financial documents. That money I'd thought was being saved for emergencies had been spent on investments that would benefit my son's family while leaving me with nothing. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the pages. 3 years of systematic fraud perpetrated by the people I trusted most in the world. Nearly $68,000, the vast majority of my life savings, redirected without my knowledge or consent. There were investment accounts in my name that I'd never opened, stock purchases I'd never authorized, even a small cryptocurrency wallet that apparently held Bitcoin worth several $1,000s, money that was technically mine, but that I'd never known existed. The most heartbreaking part was seeing how carefully they'd managed it all, never taking so much that I'd notice immediately, never leaving me completely without resources, just enough to keep me dependent and unaware while they built their own financial futures on the foundation of my poverty. I sat in that coffee shop until the afternoon light faded to evening, studying every page, understanding for the first time why my money troubles had seemed so insurmountable. It wasn't poor budgeting or inflation or even my medical expenses. It was theft, pure and simple. When I finally gathered the courage to drive home, I felt like a different person. Not just angry, though I was angrier than I'd ever been in my life, but strangely calm, focused. For the first time in years, I could see clearly. Robert was in his chair, watching the evening news when I walked in. He looked up briefly, probably expecting me to start dinner preparations or ask about his day. Instead, I sat down across from him with my bank statements spread across the coffee table between us. "We need to talk," I said. He looked at the papers, and I watched the color drain from his face. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something I'd never seen before in my husband's eyes. Guilt. Pure, undeniable guilt. "Ellie, I can explain—" "No," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "You can't. There is no explanation for this. No excuse, no justification." We sat in silence for a long moment, the sound of the television news filling the space between us. A story about a local charity drive. Something about helping seniors in need. The irony wasn't lost on me. "How long have you known about this, Robert?" He looked older suddenly, smaller somehow. The man I'd married 47 years ago seemed to shrink before my eyes. "Since the beginning," he whispered. "It was Christina's idea. But Michael, he needed help getting started, building capital. The stock market has been good to them. Their assets keep growing. Their assets, built with my money, my pension, my security. You've been stealing from me for 3 years. Not stealing, investing. The money is still there, Ellie. It's just working for the family. Working for the family, but not for me. Never for me. I trusted you with everything," I said, and for the first time my voice began to shake. "For 47 years, Robert. I trusted you with my life." He started to cry then, quiet tears that made him look even smaller and more pathetic. I know, and I'm sorry. But Christina, she made it sound so reasonable. She said we were helping Michael build his future, that the returns would benefit everyone eventually. Eventually. While I rationed my medications and shopped at discount stores and worried about how I'd afford to live if my health got worse. Where is it now? The money. Investment accounts, some stocks, a little cryptocurrency. Christina manages most of it. She says the portfolio is worth more now than what we put in. Christina manages it. Of course she did. My money, stolen by my husband, managed by my daughter-in-law for the benefit of everyone except me. That night, after Robert had gone to bed early, probably to avoid further conversation. I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to understand how my life had become something I no longer recognized, how the people I loved most had conspired against me so completely. But along with the hurt and betrayal, something else was growing inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Determination. They'd counted on my passivity, my willingness to accept whatever crumbs they offered me. They'd assumed I would never question or investigate or fight back. They were wrong. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone I'd heard about from Mrs. Ramirez across the hall, a woman who specialized in financial elder abuse. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she agreed to see me that same afternoon. "Mrs. Patterson," she said after I'd told her my story and shown her my bank records, "what's been done to you is not just morally wrong, it's criminal. Identity theft, forgery, financial fraud. Your husband and son could face serious legal consequences." Legal consequences. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd been so focused on understanding what had happened that I hadn't considered what should happen next. "But," she continued, "pursuing criminal charges would be complicated and emotionally difficult. There are other options. Civil remedies that might be more appropriate for your situation." She explained the process: freezing accounts, demanding return of stolen funds, establishing legal protections to prevent future theft. It would require documentation, court filings, confrontational meetings with my family. It would mean admitting publicly that the people I'd loved and protected had betrayed me completely. "I need to think about this," I said. "Of course. But Mrs. Patterson, while you're thinking, I'd recommend taking some immediate steps to protect yourself. Close any joint accounts. Remove your husband's access to your pension. Change passwords on financial accounts. Don't let them know you're taking these steps until after you've done them." That afternoon, I went back to Citizens Bank. Patricia helped me open new accounts, checking and savings that only I could access. We arranged for my pension to be deposited into the new checking account, cutting off Robert's access to my monthly income. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Patterson?" Patricia asked gently. "After so many years, this seems like a big change." "I'm sure," I said, and for the first time in months, I really was. The next week passed in a strange kind of limbo. Robert and I barely spoke. Michael called once, his voice casual and unconcerned, asking about dinner plans for the following Sunday. Christina stopped by to borrow sugar, or so she claimed, but her eyes were assessing, calculating, like she was trying to gauge my mood or my awareness. None of them knew yet that I'd discovered their conspiracy. None of them realized that their victim had finally woken up. Sunday dinner had been a tradition in our family for as long as I could remember. Every week, Michael and Christina would come over, sometimes bringing their daughter Emma, and we'd share a meal and conversation. It had started as something I looked forward to, a time to connect with my son and his family. But over the years, those dinners had become performances, carefully choreographed interactions where everyone pretended to care while pursuing their own agendas. This particular Sunday was going to be different. I'd prepared carefully, made Robert's favorite pot roast, baked Christina's preferred dinner rolls, set the table with my mother's good china. Everything looked normal, traditional, unchanged. But I'd also prepared in other ways, copied bank records, printed emails I'd found on Robert's computer, gathered evidence of their betrayal in a neat folder that sat beside my place at the table like a prayer book. They arrived promptly at 2:00, as always. Emma ran to hug me. She was 7 now, still young enough to show genuine affection without calculation. Michael kissed my cheek absently, his mind already elsewhere. Christina surveyed the table approvingly, like a restaurant critic checking that everything met her standards. "Smells wonderful, Eleanor," she said, though she'd barely touch her food. She'd been on various diets for as long as I'd known her, always claiming she couldn't eat this or that for health reasons that changed with the seasons. We sat down to eat, making small talk about the weather, about Emma's school, about Michael's work, the same superficial conversation we'd been having for months, maybe years. But underneath the normalcy, I could feel something building, a pressure that had been growing for so long it had to find release. "Actually," I said during a lull in conversation, "there's something I need to discuss with all of you." Robert's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Something in my tone had alerted him, though he couldn't know exactly what was coming. "What's that, Mom?" Michael asked, still focused on his plate. I reached for the folder beside my place setting and opened it carefully. The bank records inside were neatly organized, highlighted in yellow where the most damaging information appeared. "I want to talk about money," I said. The reaction was immediate and telling. Robert set down his fork completely and wouldn't meet my eyes. Christina's posture straightened and her expression became carefully neutral. Michael looked confused but wary. "Specifically," I continued, I want to talk about my money. The money that's been taken from my accounts without my knowledge or consent for the past 3 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma, sensing tension she didn't understand, stopped eating and looked around the table with wide, uncertain eyes. "Mom," Michael said slowly, "what are you talking about?" I slid the bank records across the table to him. "I'm talking about systematic theft. I'm talking about forged signatures and unauthorized transfers and investment accounts opened in my name for other people's benefit." Christina's careful composure cracked for just a moment. "Eleanor, you're clearly confused about something. Maybe we should—" "I'm not confused," I said firmly. "I'm many things right now. Hurt, angry, disappointed. But confused is not one of them." Michael was scanning the bank records, his face growing pale as he understood what he was seeing. "Mom, I can explain." "No, you can't," I said, echoing the words I'd spoken to his father days earlier. "There is no explanation that makes this acceptable. You've been stealing from me, Michael. You and your wife and your father, systematically, for years." Robert finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The investments have done well, Ellie. The money has grown. It's not really stealing if— It's not your decision to make." The words came out louder than I'd intended, filled with years of suppressed anger. "It's my money, my pension, my security, and you had no right to touch it without my permission." Emma started to cry. The adult conflict was too much for her, too scary and intense for a 7-year-old to process. Christina immediately went into damage control mode. "Emma, sweetie, why don't you go watch TV in the living room? The adults need to have a boring conversation about grown-up stuff." Once Emma was out of earshot, Christina turned back to me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the calculated pleasantness she usually wore, but something cold and calculating. "Eleanor, I think you need to calm down and think about this rationally. We've been helping you manage your finances because, frankly, you're not equipped to handle complex financial decisions anymore. The investments we've made on your behalf have been very successful. Your net worth is actually higher now than it was 3 years ago." My net worth. As if that justified anything. "I didn't ask for your help," I said. "I didn't agree to your investments. I didn't consent to having my money stolen and gambled on the stock market or hidden in cryptocurrency accounts I never knew existed." Michael was still staring at the bank records, his face a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Mom, you have to understand. Christina's father has connections in high finance. He's taught us about building wealth, creating assets, making money work harder. We were trying to help you to make sure you'd be financially secure." Financially secure. While I was rationing medications and shopping at discount stores and lying awake at night worrying about how I'd survive if my health got worse. "Michael," I said, my voice softer now but no less firm, "look at me. Really look at me." He raised his eyes reluctantly. "Do I look financially secure to you? Do I look like someone whose money has been managed well?" He couldn't answer, because we both knew the truth. While his investment accounts had grown fat with my stolen money, I'd been growing thin, physically, emotionally, financially. Christina wasn't giving up easily. She'd built her whole lifestyle on my financial foundation, and she wasn't about to let it crumble without a fight. "Eleanor, I understand you're upset, but you need to think about what's best for everyone. Michael is your son. Emma is your granddaughter. We're your family. These investments aren't just helping us. They're building security for the next generation. The next generation. Always someone else to think about, someone else whose needs were more important than mine. What about my generation, Christina? What about my security? You have Social Security. You have your pension. You have Robert to take care of you. You don't need the kind of capital growth that Michael and Emma will need for the future." I stared at her across my mother's good china. This woman who'd entered my family like a beautiful poison, corrupting everything she touched. This woman who could discuss stealing my life savings as casually as she might discuss the weather. "I have news for you, Christina," I said. "I don't have Robert to take care of me anymore. That ended the moment I discovered he'd been betraying me, and I don't have a son to rely on anymore either. That ended when Michael decided his wife's greed was more important than his mother's well-being. Now it was Michael's turn to get defensive. "Mom, that's not fair. We never meant to hurt you. Everything we did was what? For my own good? For the family?" "Those are just excuses, Michael. Pretty words to disguise ugly actions." I stood up from the table, leaving my dinner half-eaten. The conversation could continue, but I'd said what I needed to say. The rest was just damage control and manipulation. Tactics I'd finally learned to recognize. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, my voice calm and clear. "All of my money, every penny that was taken from my accounts, is going to be returned, immediately, today. The investment accounts opened without my permission are going to be closed, and the funds transferred back to accounts I control. And if this doesn't happen voluntarily, I have a lawyer who's very interested in pursuing criminal charges for financial elder abuse. The word criminal had an immediate effect. Robert looked like he might be sick. Michael's face went white. Only Christina maintained her composure, though I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. Eleanor, let's not be hasty about involving lawyers. I'm sure we can work something out as a family. We're not family anymore, Christina. Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't lie and manipulate and betray trust. Whatever we were before, that ended when you decided I was nothing more than a bank account to raid whenever you needed money. I walked toward my bedroom, then turned back to face them one last time. You have until tomorrow morning to return my money. All of it. If it's not in my account by noon, I'm filing a police report. I closed my bedroom door behind me and locked it. Something I'd never done before in my own home. But then again, I'd never needed to lock my door against people I'd trusted with my life. Through the thin walls, I could hear urgent whispered conversations. Christina's voice sharp and angry. Michael's pleading and confused. Robert's broken and defeated. The scrape of chairs against the wooden floor as they moved around my kitchen, probably planning their next move. I didn't care anymore. The worst had already happened. The people I'd loved most had betrayed me completely, and I'd survived the knowledge. Everything else was just details. That night, alone in my bedroom with its restored order and familiar comfort, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not happiness. That would come later if it came at all. But a deep, quiet peace that came from finally knowing the truth and finally being willing to act on it. The next morning, I woke to find a cashier's check slid under my bedroom door. $68,437. My money, returned without apology or explanation. Robert was gone, not permanently, but for the day, probably giving me space to process, or maybe giving himself time to figure out how to rebuild a marriage built on 47 years of trust that had been shattered in a single conversation. Michael called that afternoon, his voice strained and formal. Mom, we've returned the money like you asked. I hope you understand that we never intended to hurt you, and we hope we can find a way to move forward as a family. Michael, I said, I love you. I will always love you because you're my son, but love isn't enough anymore. Trust is earned and respect is required, and until you understand that, we don't have much to talk about. Christina got on the phone then, her voice artificially sweet. Eleanor, I want you to know that I never meant for things to get so complicated. We were just trying to help, and maybe we made some mistakes in how we went about it. I hope you can forgive us and we can put this behind us. Forgive us. Put this behind us. As if 3 years of systematic theft could be erased with a few apologetic words and a return check. Christina, I said, I want you to understand something clearly. I know exactly who you are now. The masks are off. The pretending is over. You orchestrated the theft of my life savings not to help me or even to help Michael, but to build your own financial security at my expense. You turned my husband against me and my son against his own conscience. You treated me like a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. That's not a mistake. That's not a misunderstanding. That's who you are. Eleanor, I think you're being dramatic. I'm being truthful. And here's another truth. You will never get another penny from me. Not for rent, not for emergencies, not for investments, not for anything. If you can't support your lifestyle on Michael's income, then you need to change your lifestyle. I'm no longer available to subsidize your greed. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Christina had built her entire financial strategy around access to my money. Without it, their carefully constructed life of European vacation plans and real estate investments would come crashing down. I hope you reconsider, she said finally, for the sake of your relationship with Michael and Emma. There it was. The threat I'd been expecting. My relationship with my son and granddaughter held hostage to ensure my financial compliance. Christina, I said, if Michael chooses your greed over his mother's well-being, that will tell me everything I need to know about the man I raised. And if you use Emma as a weapon in this conflict, that will tell me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are. I hung up the phone then, my hands shaking but my resolve firm. The days that followed were strange and difficult. Robert and I existed in the same apartment like polite strangers, navigating around each other's presence without really connecting. He slept in the guest room and took his meals at odd hours, avoiding the kitchen when I was cooking. Our conversations were limited to practical matters: whose turn it was to get the mail, what bills needed to be paid, whether the heat should be turned up. It would have been easy to pretend nothing had happened, to accept his obvious remorse and his attempts at making amends, to rebuild our marriage on the shaky foundation of forgiveness and resume trust. But I couldn't do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The man I'd been married to for 47 years had systematically stolen from me for 3 years. had forged my signature on financial documents, had lied to my face every single day while watching me struggle with money problems he'd created. How do you come back from that? How do you trust someone again after a betrayal so fundamental it changes the nature of your entire relationship? Michael called periodically, awkward attempts to maintain contact without taking responsibility for what he'd done. Our conversations were stilted and brief, filled with the kind of small talk you make with distant acquaintances rather than family members. Christina, meanwhile, had apparently decided that time and persistence would eventually wear down my resistance. She started leaving small gifts outside my door. Flowers from the grocery store, boxes of tea, paperback novels she thought I might enjoy. Each gift came with a note expressing concern for my well-being and hopes that we could rebuild our relationship. But the gifts felt like bribes, and the notes felt like manipulation. The same strategies she'd always used, just more obviously calculated now that I understood her true nature. 3 weeks after our confrontation, Emma appeared at my door. Not with her parents, but alone. Or at least unsupervised for the few minutes it took to knock and run back to whoever had brought her. "Grandma Eleanor," she said, her 7-year-old voice solemn with adult concern she shouldn't have to carry. "Mommy and Daddy said you don't want to see us anymore." My heart broke a little more. Of course they'd involve Emma. Of course they'd use an innocent child to apply emotional pressure I couldn't resist. "That's not true, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to her level. "I always want to see you. You're my granddaughter, and I love you very much." "Then why don't you come to dinner anymore? Why doesn't Daddy want to talk to you? How do you explain financial fraud and family betrayal to a 7-year-old? How do you tell a child that her parents have been stealing from her grandmother without destroying her sense of security and trust?" "Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements about important things," I said carefully. "And sometimes those disagreements take time to work out. But that has nothing to do with how much I love you, okay?" She nodded, but I could see the confusion and hurt in her eyes. Another casualty of her parents' greed and poor choices. After Emma left, I sat in my kitchen and cried. Not the angry tears I'd shed when I first discovered the theft, but grief for everything that had been lost. The family dinners that would never be the same. The easy affection that had been poisoned by betrayal. The grandmother-grandchild relationship that was being used as a weapon in an adult conflict. That night, I made a decision that surprised me. I was going to take a trip. Not the imaginary weekend in Milwaukee I'd used to cover my hospital stay, but a real vacation. Somewhere I'd always wanted to go, but had never allowed myself the expense or the indulgence. New York City. I'd always dreamed of seeing Broadway shows and visiting museums and walking through Central Park. But it had seemed impossible, too expensive, too impractical, too frivolous for someone living on a pension. But now, with my stolen money returned and my financial situation actually understood, I realized I could afford it. Not lavishly, but comfortably. Enough to stay in a decent hotel and see a few shows and eat in restaurants instead of subsisting on discount groceries and generic medications. The decision felt radical, rebellious in a way I'd never been before. For so many years, I'd denied myself small pleasures to ensure there was always money available for family emergencies and requests. I'd lived like a pauper while my stolen money funded other people's investments and vacations and lifestyle choices. No more. I called a travel agent, an old-fashioned approach in an internet age, but I wanted to talk to a real person about my plans. Margaret at Lakeview Travel was patient and helpful, understanding that I was a senior traveler with specific needs and concerns. "Mrs. Patterson," she said after we'd discussed hotel options and show tickets and restaurant reservations, "if you don't mind me saying so, you sound excited. Like this trip means something special to you." "It does," I said. "It's the first thing I've done for myself in longer than I can remember." "Well then," Margaret replied, "let's make sure it's wonderful." 2 weeks later, I boarded an Amtrak train at Union Station, bound for New York City. My suitcase was packed with clothes I'd bought specifically for the trip. Not expensive, but new and cheerful and mine. I'd even gotten my hair done at a real salon instead of the discount chain I'd been using to save money. Robert drove me to the station, our first extended time together since the confrontation. The ride was mostly silent, but as he helped me with my suitcase, he spoke. "Ellie, I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I made terrible choices. I let them convince me that I was helping instead of stealing, and I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the man I'd fallen in love with all those decades ago. Older now, grayed by time and burdened by guilt, but still recognizable underneath the damage. "I know you're sorry, Robert, and I know you love me. But love without respect isn't enough. Trust without honesty isn't real. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not being taken advantage of. And you need to figure out who you are when you're not enabling other people's bad behavior." He nodded, tears in his eyes. Take as long as you need. I'll be here when you get back. I know you will, I said. The question is whether that will be enough. The train pulled away from Chicago as the sun was setting, carrying me towards something I'd never allowed myself to imagine, a life built around my own choices instead of other people's needs. New York City was everything I'd dreamed and more. The energy of the streets, the diversity of faces and languages and cultures, the sense that anything was possible for anyone brave enough to reach for it. I stayed in a small hotel in Midtown. Nothing fancy but clean and safe and perfectly located for walking to theaters and museums. I saw The Lion King on Broadway and cried during Circle of Life. I spent an entire afternoon in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, losing myself in paintings and sculptures that spoke to parts of my soul I'd forgotten existed. I walked through Central Park in the snow, watching families play and couples hold hands and dogs chase sticks with unbridled joy. But the most transformative moment came on my third day there. I was sitting in a small cafe in Greenwich Village, eating lunch and watching people pass by the window, when a woman at the next table struck up a conversation. "Are you visiting New York?" she asked, her accent marking her as a local. "Yes, from Chicago, first time." "How wonderful. What's been your favorite part so far?" I thought about this question seriously. What had been my favorite part? The shows were spectacular, the museums inspiring, the city itself endlessly fascinating, but the real answer was simpler and more profound. "The feeling of belonging to myself again," I said. The woman smiled, understanding somehow. "That's the best kind of vacation." That night, in my small hotel room with the sounds of the city humming beneath my window, I called my friend Martha in Milwaukee, the same Martha I'd supposedly visited when I was really in the hospital. "Eleanor, how are you, dear? I've been so worried since you said you couldn't make it that weekend. Is everything all right?" I told her everything. The theft, the betrayal, the confrontation, the trip. All of it poured out in a rush of words and emotions I'd been holding back for too long. "Oh, honey," Martha said when I finished. "I'm so sorry, but I have to tell you, from what you've described, this Christina sounds like she was planning this for a long time, using your son to get to you, turning your husband against his better judgment. You said she comes from money?" "Yes, her family is quite wealthy. Real estate, investments, Bitcoin, that sort of thing." "Then why did she need your pension money? If her father is so successful with investments, why couldn't he fund their lifestyle?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on the betrayal and the theft that I hadn't considered the logic behind it. Why would someone from a wealthy family need to steal from an elderly woman on a limited income? "Martha, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe her family's wealth isn't as real as she pretends. Maybe their fortune exists more in stories than in bank accounts. Maybe you were targeted specifically because you were vulnerable and trusting and had no one to protect you from financial abuse." The idea was so horrifying I could barely process it. Had I been marked as a victim from the very beginning? Had Michael's whirlwind romance and quick engagement been orchestrated as a way to gain access to my finances? "I need to do some research," I told Martha. "Be careful, Eleanor. If I'm right, these people are more dangerous than you know." The next morning, instead of sightseeing, I found an internet cafe and began searching for information about Christina's family. Public records, business filings, news articles, anything that might reveal the truth about their supposed wealth. What I found was disturbing. Christina's father had indeed been involved in real estate, but not as a successful investor. He'd been prosecuted for mortgage fraud 5 years earlier. Her family's assets had been frozen pending investigation, and several of their properties had been foreclosed upon. The cryptocurrency investments she'd mentioned? Her father's Bitcoin wallet had been emptied by hackers 3 years ago, right around the time Christina had married Michael and started her campaign to gain access to my finances. Far from being wealthy, Christina's family was financially desperate, and I had been their salvation. My pension, my savings, my modest but steady income had been the foundation for their recovery. I was not a beloved family member who needed financial management. I was a mark, a target, a victim selected and cultivated by people who specialized in financial fraud. The depth of the betrayal was breathtaking, not just my husband and son's weakness, but Christina's calculated predation. She had apparently studied me, identified my vulnerabilities, and designed a long-term strategy to extract as much money as possible before I became aware of what was happening. That afternoon, from my hotel room overlooking the city that had given me back my sense of self, I called Sarah Chen, my lawyer in Chicago. "Mrs. Patterson, how is your vacation going?" "It's been eye-opening in more ways than one. Sarah, I need you to investigate Christina Morrison's family. I think their theft from me might be part of a larger pattern of financial fraud. I'll look into it immediately. Are you prepared for what we might find?" "I'm prepared for the truth," I said. whatever that truth might be. 3 days later, Sarah called me back with information that confirmed my worst suspicions. Christina's family had been involved in multiple financial schemes over the past decade. Elder fraud, investment scams, identity theft. They were career criminals who specialized in targeting vulnerable seniors. Mrs. Patterson, I think you were selected specifically because you fit their victim profile. Recent widow. I'm not a widow. My husband is still alive. I'm sorry, let me clarify. The records I found suggest they believed you were a widow. Somehow they had incorrect information about your marital status, which probably made you seem like a more vulnerable target. Recent widow, limited income, adult children who might need financial assistance. Yes, I could see how I would have appeared to be an ideal mark for their schemes. What do we do now? We have several options. We can pursue criminal charges against all of them, your husband, your son, and your daughter-in-law. We can file civil suits to recover damages beyond just the stolen money, or we can use what we know as leverage to ensure they never contact you again. Criminal charges against my own family. The thought was overwhelming, but not as overwhelming as the realization that my family might not actually be my family at all, at least not in any meaningful sense. I need time to think about this. Of course. But Mrs. Patterson, I want you to understand something. What was done to you wasn't just wrong. It was criminal. And the people who did it are not just greedy family members making poor choices. They're experienced predators who have done this before and will almost certainly do it again to other vulnerable seniors. That night, I walked through Times Square, surrounded by lights and noise and life, and tried to process everything I'd learned. My marriage was based on betrayal. My relationship with my son was built on financial exploitation. My daughter-in-law was a career criminal who had targeted me from the moment she entered our lives. But strangely, instead of feeling devastated, I felt liberated. The truth, however painful, had set me free from illusions that had been making me miserable for years. I was no longer trapped by loyalty to people who had never been loyal to me. I was no longer bound by love for people who had never truly loved me back. I was 72 years old, and for the first time in decades, my life was entirely my own. The next morning, I extended my stay in New York for another week. Then I called Robert. How's the trip going, Ellie? It's been educational. Robert, I need you to move out of the apartment. Not permanently, necessarily, but for now. I need space to decide what I want my life to look like going forward. There was a long silence. I understand. Where should I go? That's not my problem to solve anymore. You're a grown man, Robert. You've been making financial decisions without my input for years. I'm sure you can figure out living arrangements without my help, too. Ellie, please. I know I made terrible mistakes, but we can work through this. We can rebuild what we had. No, we can't. What we had was built on lies and deception. You can't rebuild something that was never real in the first place. When I returned to Chicago the following week, Robert was gone. He'd left a note explaining that he was staying with his brother in Rockford, at least temporarily. The apartment felt different with just me in it. Not emptier, but cleaner somehow. Free of the undercurrent of tension and deception that had been poisoning our home for years. Michael called that evening. Mom, Dad told me he moved out. Don't you think you're being a little extreme? He made a mistake, but people can change. Families can heal. Michael, I said, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I know about Christina's family. I know about her father's legal problems and their financial situation. I know that I was targeted specifically because I fit the profile of a vulnerable senior who could be exploited for financial gain. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. I don't know what you mean, he said finally. But his voice lacked conviction. Yes, you do. The question is whether you were part of the plan from the beginning, or whether you were just weak enough to go along with it once it started. Mom, that's crazy. Christina loves our family. She loves you. Christina is a criminal, Michael. Her family specializes in defrauding elderly people, and you helped her do it to your own mother. Another silence, longer this time. What do you want from me? He asked finally. I want you to tell me the truth, all of it. When did you know what was happening? How long have you been aware that your wife was stealing from me? And what were you planning to do when there was no money left to steal? But he couldn't answer those questions. Or wouldn't. The conversation ended with promises to talk more later that we both knew would never be kept. Over the following weeks, I began the process of rebuilding my life from the ground up. I changed banks, updated my insurance policies, revised my will to remove family members who had betrayed my trust. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in helping seniors recover from financial abuse. Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Williams said during one of our sessions, what you experienced wasn't just theft. It was a systematic campaign designed to destroy your sense of reality and your trust in your own judgment. The fact that you were able to recognize what was happening and take action to protect yourself shows incredible strength. Strength. I'd never thought of myself as strong. For most of my life, I'd seen myself as someone who endured, who sacrificed, who made the best of difficult situations. But recognizing abuse and taking action to stop it, maybe that was its own kind of strength. The legal resolution came 6 months later. Rather than pursuing criminal charges that would have been emotionally devastating and legally complex, I agreed to a settlement that included full restitution, a restraining order that prevented any member of Christina's family from contacting me, and a legal agreement that Michael would have supervised visitation rights with Emma, but no access to my finances or personal information. Robert and I began marriage counseling, though neither of us was sure it would be successful. Trust, once broken so completely, is difficult to rebuild. But Dr. Martinez, our counselor, helped us understand that we were essentially starting over, not trying to repair our old relationship, but potentially building a new one based on honesty and mutual respect. Eleanor, she said during one session, you've established very clear boundaries about what you will and won't accept in a relationship. That's healthy. Robert, your job is to prove through consistent action that you can respect those boundaries and be the kind of partner Eleanor deserves. It was slow work, complicated by years of accumulated hurt and disappointment, but gradually, we began to find our way back to each other. Not to who we'd been before, that couple was gone forever, but to who we might become going forward. Robert found his own apartment, but spent most evenings at home with me. We had dinner together, watched our old favorite shows, talked about everything except the topic that had nearly destroyed us. He was different now, more careful, more attentive, more aware of how his actions affected me. Whether it was genuine change or just better performance remained to be seen, but it was progress. The biggest surprise came from Emma. Despite Christina's attempts to turn her against me, my granddaughter began calling me regularly. Not long conversations. She was still a child with limited attention span, but sweet, genuine connections that reminded me why family relationships could be worth fighting for. Grandma Eleanor, she said during one call, Mommy says you don't want to see us anymore, but I told her that's not true. You told me you love me no matter what. That's exactly right, sweetheart. I will always love you, and I will always want to see you. Sometimes grown-ups have to work out complicated problems, but that never changes how much I love you. Through Emma, I learned that Michael and Christina's marriage was struggling. The loss of access to my money had apparently created financial stress they couldn't manage, and their relationship was beginning to crack under the pressure. I felt no satisfaction in this news. Their problems would ultimately affect Emma, and that broke my heart. But I also felt no obligation to rescue them. They had made their choices, and now they would live with the consequences. A year after my trip to New York, I took another vacation, this time to San Francisco to visit my college roommate, Janet, whom I'd lost touch with decades earlier. Like Martha, Janet listened to my story with amazement and support. Eleanor, you sound like a completely different person from the woman I used to know. Stronger, more confident. What changed? I thought about her question as we sat in a cafe overlooking the Pacific Ocean, watching waves crash against the rocks below. I stopped accepting unacceptable behavior, I said finally. I stopped making excuses for people who didn't respect me. I stopped believing that love meant allowing yourself to be mistreated. And how does it feel? Lonely sometimes, scary sometimes, but mostly peaceful. For the first time in years, I feel peaceful. That evening, Janet and I attended a lecture at the University of California about financial literacy for seniors. The speaker, Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, discussed the epidemic of financial elder abuse and the warning signs that families and friends should watch for. During the question and answer period, I stood up. Dr. Gonzalez, what would you say to someone who has experienced financial abuse from family members? How do you rebuild trust after such a fundamental betrayal? She looked at me with kind, knowing eyes. I would say that trust is earned through consistent, respectful behavior over time, and that you don't owe anyone forgiveness just because they're related to you. Family relationships, like all relationships, must be based on mutual respect and care. When those elements are missing, you have every right to protect yourself, financially, emotionally, and legally. After the lecture, Dr. Gonzalez approached me. Thank you for asking that question. I could tell it was personal, and it takes courage to speak publicly about family financial abuse. Actually, I said, surprising myself with my boldness, I've been thinking about sharing my story more widely, maybe writing about it or speaking to other seniors who might be experiencing similar situations. That's wonderful. There's such a need for survivor voices in this area. Would you be interested in speaking at some of our community education events? And so began another chapter of my new life. Over the next year, I spoke at senior centers, community colleges, and financial literacy workshops throughout the Chicago area. I shared my story not as a victim, but as someone who had recognized abuse and taken action to stop it. The response was overwhelming. After every presentation, seniors would approach me with their own stories of family financial abuse. Some were just beginning to recognize the signs. Others had suffered for years without understanding that what was happening to them was criminal. A few had found the courage to take action but needed support and encouragement to continue. I started a small support group that met monthly at the local library. We called ourselves the Golden Year Guardians, a name suggested by Rose, an 84-year-old whose son had been forging her Social Security checks for 2 years before she discovered his fraud. "Eleanor," Rose said after one of our meetings, "thank you for helping me understand that I wasn't crazy or paranoid or ungrateful. Thank you for helping me see that I deserved better." That might have been the most meaningful compliment I'd ever received. Robert and I eventually renewed our vows, not in a church with family and flowers, but in Dr. Martinez's office with our counselor as our witness. It wasn't romantic or traditional, but it was honest. We promised to respect each other's autonomy, to communicate honestly about finances, to never again allow outside pressures to compromise our commitment to each other. "This isn't the marriage we had before," Robert said during our private ceremony. "This is better. Based on truth this time instead of assumptions and habits." He was right. Our new relationship was smaller but stronger. We'd lost the easy intimacy that comes from decades of shared experience, but we'd gained something more valuable: genuine partnership based on mutual choice rather than obligation. Michael and I maintained limited contact, mostly focused on Emma's needs and well-being. Christina had apparently moved back to live with her in-laws while facing legal consequences for her family's financial crimes. Michael was working 2 jobs to support himself and pay child support, finally understanding what it meant to live within his actual means rather than someone else's stolen money. "Mom," he said during one of our brief phone conversations, "I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to know that I'm getting counseling too. Trying to understand how I let things get so bad." "That's good, Michael. For you and for Emma. Do you think, someday, we might be able to have a real relationship again?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I hope so. Time will tell." Emma continued to be the bright spot in all of this family wreckage. Now 9 years old, she was old enough to understand some of what had happened, though we were careful not to burden her with adult conflicts she shouldn't have to carry. "Grandma Eleanor," she said during one of her visits, "I'm glad you learned to be strong. Mommy says you changed, but I think you just learned who you really are." Out of the mouths of babes. On my 74th birthday, I threw myself a party. A real party, with decorations and a cake from the good bakery and invitations to friends I'd reconnected with over the past 2 years. Robert was there, along with Martha, who made the trip from Milwaukee, Janet, who flew in from San Francisco, and several members of my Golden Year Guardians support group. "Make a wish," Rose said as I prepared to blow out the candles. I looked around at the faces of people who genuinely cared about me, not because of what I could give them, but because of who I was, and realized my wish had already come true. I had learned to value myself. I had learned to demand respect. I had learned that love without respect is not love at all. But I made a wish anyway, that every senior experiencing financial abuse would find the courage to seek help and the strength to demand better treatment from the people who claim to love them. As my guests sang "Happy Birthday" in voices both young and old, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine happiness. Not the temporary pleasure that comes from making other people happy, but deep, lasting contentment that comes from living authentically. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and Robert was cleaning up in the kitchen, I sat by my window looking out at the Chicago skyline, the same view I'd had for decades, but somehow it looked different now. Brighter, more full of possibility. I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years earlier, afraid, exploited, diminished by people who should have protected and cherished her. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. Someone I'd known long ago but had outgrown. The journey from victim to survivor to advocate had been painful and lonely at times, but it had also been transformative. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, that I deserved respect and honesty and genuine care. That family relationships had to be earned through love and trust, not demanded through obligation and guilt. Most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to change your life. At 74, I was more truly myself than I'd ever been. More independent, more confident, more at peace with my own worth and value. My phone rang, interrupting my reverie. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer anyway. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Jennifer Walsh from the National Center for Elder Justice. Dr. Gonzalez gave me your contact information. We're organizing a national conference on financial elder abuse, and we'd love to have you as one of our keynote speakers. A keynote speaker. Me. A few years ago, I would have been too intimidated and insecure to even consider such an opportunity. Now the idea energized me. I'd be honored, I said. After I hung up, Robert came into the living room with 2 cups of tea, a nightly ritual we'd established in our rebuilt relationship. Good news? He asked, settling into his chair beside mine. The best kind, I said. An opportunity to help other people avoid what I went through. He nodded, understanding without needing details. This was one of the gifts of our new relationship. He trusted my judgment now, supported my choices without trying to control or manage them. We sat quietly for a while, sipping our tea and watching the lights of the city twinkle below us. It occurred to me that this moment, peaceful, genuine, unhurried, was exactly what I'd been longing for through all those years of chaos and exploitation. Robert, I said, do you ever regret what happened? I mean, do you wish things could go back to the way they were? He considered this carefully, the way he'd learned to consider all his responses since we'd begun rebuilding our relationship. I regret the harm that was done, he said finally. I regret my part in it. I regret the pain you experienced and the trust that was broken. But go back? No. What we had before wasn't healthy for either of us. You were being taken advantage of, and I was enabling it. This is better. He was right. This was better. Harder sometimes, but better. More honest, more respectful, more real. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, the same mirror where I'd stared at a broken woman with haunted eyes just a few years earlier. The woman looking back at me now was older, grayer, marked by the passage of time and the weight of difficult experiences. But her eyes were clear and bright, and her expression was peaceful. I'd survived financial abuse, family betrayal, and the dissolution of relationships I'd thought were permanent. I'd learned to stand up for myself, to demand respect, to value my own worth. I'd built new relationships based on honesty and mutual care. I'd found ways to help other people facing similar challenges. At 74, I was living the most authentic life I'd ever known. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. Emma, now tall for her 9 years and carrying her school backpack, standing outside my door with a handwritten card. "Happy birthday, Grandma Eleanor," she said, throwing her arms around me in the kind of spontaneous hug that reminded me why some family relationships are worth preserving. "I made this for you at school." The card was decorated with crayon flowers and glitter, and inside she'd written, "Thank you for teaching me that it's okay to be strong." As I held my granddaughter and read her words, I felt the deepest satisfaction I'd ever experienced. Not just because I'd survived my own ordeal, but because I'd somehow managed to model strength and self-respect for the next generation. Emma would grow up knowing that love doesn't mean accepting mistreatment. That family loyalty can't be bought with money or manipulated through guilt. That respect is earned through behavior, not demanded through obligation. These were lessons I'd learned too late in life, but not too late to matter. Standing in my kitchen with Emma chattering about school and friends and her plans for the weekend, I realized that my story wasn't really about financial abuse or family betrayal. It was about transformation, about discovering that you can reinvent yourself at any age, that you can choose dignity over peace, that you can build a life worth living even after everything you thought you knew has fallen apart. If you're listening to this and something about it feels familiar, if you're struggling with family members who see you as a bank account rather than a person, if you're giving more than you're receiving, if you're afraid to say no because you might lose people who don't really respect you anyway, please know that it's never too late to change course. Your worth is not determined by how much money you give to other people. Your value as a family member is not measured by your willingness to accept unacceptable treatment. Your love for others does not require you to allow yourself to be exploited or diminished. You deserve respect. You deserve honesty. You deserve relationships built on mutual care and genuine affection, not financial dependency and emotional manipulation. And if you don't have those things in your life right now, you have the power to change that situation. It won't be easy. It might be lonely at times. You might lose people who were never really in your corner to begin with, but you will gain something infinitely more valuable: yourself, your dignity, your peace of mind, your right to live authentically according to your own values and choices. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you watched a friend or family member struggle with financial abuse from people who claim to love them? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to make their own changes. And if this video resonated with you, If it gave you hope or helped you see your own situation more clearly, please consider liking it and subscribing to this channel. When we share our stories, the painful ones and the triumphant ones, we help each other find the strength to demand better treatment and build better lives. Because sometimes the hardest journey is the one that leads us home to ourselves, but it's also the most worthwhile journey we'll ever take. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And remember, you are worth so much more than you've been taught to believe.